The left zone contains the inspector as well as some other things, but the inspector is one of the most critical things to use when you're in Cubase. Let's take a look at where the inspector is. It is on a separate tab in the left zone, right next to the visibility tab. We'll talk about visibility in just a moment. But if for some reason you can't see anything in the inspector, it probably means that you don't have any tracks in your project. In other words, if we were to right or control click on this track and remove it, then the inspector will basically go blank and all you'll see is the stereo output. But let's go ahead and undo by hitting Control or Command Z, and we'll get our MIDI track back. And if you have a selected track and you still don't see anything in the inspector, chances are it's because you have the Editor tab selected at the bottom. So make sure that you're on the Track tab as well as the Inspector tab. And now let's look at some of the parameters of our first MIDI track. So on the Inspector tab itself, it actually has multiple sections, and these are also called tabs. If you have them all closed, then you can just see the names of those individual tabs. There's the Track tab, Track Versions, Chords, Expression Map, and so forth. But to reveal the settings inside of any of those tabs, you'll need to have the tab open, and you do that just by clicking on it. For example, on the Track tab itself, at the very top here, we have some things like mute and solo and automation, read and write. Those control buttons are duplicated on the track themselves. So tracks also have their own individual mute, solo, and so forth. But then we also have the volume, panning, the track delay, and then critically, we have the MIDI input settings and the MIDI output settings. We also have the MIDI channel number assignment and the program change, including the bank select parameter. Then there's also the setting for drum map and so forth. But that's on the first tab. If we go to the next tab, then we're looking at the track versions. And if you want to get to the next tab down, you don't necessarily have to close the previous tab. What you can do is just click on the next tab. It will automatically close the previously open tab and open the new tab. And so those all work the same way. But if you want multiple tabs open at the same time, you can hold down Control or Command to open multiple tabs at the same time. Now, the tabs themselves will change depending on what track type you have selected here in the track list. I have a MIDI track selected now, but let's add an audio track. Let's hit the little plus button right here, which will open the Add Track dialog box. Let's go to Audio, and let's just call this Audio 1. And let's configure it for stereo for right now. Then we'll click on Add Track. And you'll notice that some tabs look very, very similar. In other words, if we open the Track tab, we have a lot of the same controls, but instead of having MIDI input and output destinations, we have audio input and output destinations. And you'll notice that they change depending on which track you have selected. So here's what a MIDI track looks like in the inspector, but if we click on the audio track, then the parameters change because MIDI and audio tracks have different types of parameters. They also have different types of tabs. In other words, the Inserts tab on an audio track is different than the MIDI inserts on a MIDI or instrument track. There's fewer of them in the MIDI track, and they also work with MIDI information instead of audio information. So that's why this says MIDI inserts instead of just inserts. And then the types and names of those tabs will change again if we add an instrument track. So here's another way to add tracks. You can just right or control click in the track list itself and then choose the track type that you want to add. So let's add an instrument track. We will use Halion Sonic, and then as soon as that track appears, then we'll see that some of the tabs are similar between both the MIDI tracks and the audio tracks, because an instrument track has a MIDI front end and an audio back end. So an instrument track can have both MIDI inserts and audio inserts. Here's the audio inserts tab, and then underneath that are the MIDI inserts. And one of the most important buttons on the inspector for an instrument track is the button that reveals the control panel for the associated VST instrument. In this case, Halion Sonic SE, which comes with Cubase. If I were to close that window to reveal more of my project window, then how do I get it back? Well, there's a number of different ways to do that. One way is under the main track tab. if you come here, there's a little icon that looks like a little tiny keyboard with an arrow pointing to it. That's the Edit Instrument button. When you click on it, it reveals the control panel. But there's multiple different ways to reveal it. There's the button on the Track tab, but there's the same button on the Instrument tab, so we can click on that button there to reveal it. And if you don't have the inspector visible, an instrument track itself has that little Edit Instrument button on it. You'll notice that the other tracks, the MIDI and audio track, don't have that button. Only instrument tracks have that. So that button allows you to reveal the control panel for the associated VST instrument. And next, let's talk about some of the visibility options.